No adult I knew growing up would have said, if somebody doesn't have a job, they're lazy. That was just not, that might be a sort of small c conservative view, but it's not, I never would have heard that. But I absolutely heard people say, well, if you don't, why don't people vote? If you don't vote, you have no right to complain. And when I wrote this book and when I researched this book, what I learned is that in so many cases, it's the opposite, that people can't complain because they have no right to vote or they have no ability to vote.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, BPL President and host for our virtual series on the arc of history. The library promotes discourse, lifelong learning, and civic engagement, free to all. Tonight's program is our third in this series and will follow a slightly different format where I'll be joined by two distinguished guests, initially in conversation with each other. A final introductory note: you can borrow books that will be mentioned this evening and others from bpl.org or your local library, or purchase your own copy from independent bookstores such as our other partner, Trident Booksellers and Cafe. And now, to begin our conversation, let's go over to David and Cecile. Welcome to you both.
Hi, David.
Hello, there's a plethora of Davids here, or at least two of us.
We have an abundance of Davids, exactly. Yeah. You can't have too many. This is really exciting. Thanks for letting me talk to you about your book, interview you, whatever. You're a really funny person. This book is about a very serious topic, and I have all kinds of serious questions. But maybe we could just, for folks who don't know you as well, maybe you could just tell us, since I'm a huge fan just because I did get to see the president at all his correspondents dinners back when they actually happened and they were funny. Okay, so just tell me can you tell us your best President Obama joke from a White House Correspondent Dinner that you wrote?
Well, I will think of some that I enjoyed the most to be a part of. And let me first start by saying my theory of book tours, and based on my vast sample size of having written one book, is that I would just want to be in conversation with, just talking with people who I'd want to talk to, even if there was no one watching. And then sometimes you also get to talk to people who are among your political heroes. So this is a real exciting moment for me. I'm a little, I think thrilled would be an understatement. And so thank you so much for being part of this. And it's funny, actually, I wrote about in my first book being part of the 2012 convention speechwriting team. So there were 12, 15 of us packed shoulder to shoulder, and they were kind of divvying out who gets to write for who gets to help out with which speech. And obviously people come in with their own stuff, but we would help out a little bit. And so I remember, when your name came up, the fight over who would get to work with Cecile Richards on her convention speech. And I did not win that fight, sadly, but so I've been a fan for a long time. Now, when it comes to the correspondence dinners, I will say I was really lucky because I got to be part of all of these moments at the White House that are so much lower stakes than typical decisions at the White House, which meant that, I took my job really seriously, but I also knew that ultimately if something went wrong, it was not going to be the worst thing that went wrong for Barack Obama, or at least not the worst thing that could go wrong. I will say one of the things that I was most excited to be part of, and it was just an experience I'll remember forever, was bringing in Keegan-Michael Key, and he played Luther, Obama's anger translator. And I don't know if maybe some of you watching remember this, but Keegan, so the premise was that on his show, Key and Peele, Jordan Peele would play Obama, very cool, calm, and collected, and then Keegan would come in and just yell about all the nonsense America was putting him through. And it will not surprise you to learn that President Obama really liked this character a lot. And so he kept trying to get us to bring, he had other things to do. He was not writing jokes, day to day, but he kept on, we kept hearing the president would really like it if we could bring Keegan and have Luther the anger translator in person. And finally in 2015, we got to do it. And my favorite part of that experience when I look back on it was that the whole time we were rehearsing in the map room of the White House, and the president would say his line, and then Luther, the anger translator, Keegan, would translate for him. And every single time, President Obama just lost it. He could not stop laughing. And I was not sure he was going to be able to hold it together for the actual performance, although he did. But it's one of those moments where, in retrospect, that seemed like just a fun thing. But now you think about it, and Trump never laughs. And President Obama, turns out so many of my experiences with him involve in one way or another him laughing. And I just think about like those little things like that. You end up learning a lot about somebody and how they lead.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, because yes, he had an incredible sense of timing, and he was able to laugh and laugh at himself, which is, you know, as we know, somewhat unique with political leaders. So anyway, well, thanks for making him even funnier. And I'm sorry we didn't get to work on the convention speech together, so we'll have to find something else to do. So I know that we're here to talk about your new book, and it's about a very important topic, which is democracy. And I want to ask you about why you wrote the book, but I know that one of the things I wrote down from really early in the book is, you know, why is it that our representative government no longer seemed interested in representing us, which I think is such a fundamental problem that we have today. Of course, I come from the state of Texas, where because of the way in which things have been gerrymandered for so many years, representative government is a distant, far off idea. But anyway, I thought that was really an excellent way of talking about, I assume, what kind of led you to write this new book.
Well, what led me to write the book was a realization I had on Inauguration Day, when President Trump was being sworn in, and I was in Disney World because it was also my wife's birthday. And we decided we wanted to go to the one place that we were going to be guaranteed we wouldn't be seeing the inauguration on TV. But of course, I was still paying attention on my phone, or, you know, couldn't look away. And maybe it had one too many of those Disney rum and cokes, trying to, you know, ease the stress a little bit of the moment. But I remember having this thought, which is, it started with this idea that we all understand because of the Electoral College, that we, the people, wanted one president and we got someone else. But what was remarkable to me about that was how ordinary that kind of thing was. So it wasn't just that for a young person today, the person who has become president pretty regularly is not the person the voters choose. It's also that on issue after issue after issue, so on gun violence and gun safety, on climate change, certainly on when it comes to abortion access and women's health care and healthcare in general. And today we're seeing this when it comes to how we respond to COVID, or how we do something about policing in this country and do more about racial justice. On all of these issues, Americans keep asking for one thing from their leaders, and the experts keep saying, yeah, that's a good idea. The American people have it right. And yet our government is doing the opposite. And so, you know, when I was in the Obama White House and Democrats were in charge, I felt like change was more difficult than it should be. And then during the Trump era with Republicans in charge, change, you know, is not just difficult, it's that we keep moving backwards. And I had this moment of, how would you explain this kind of a democracy to a Martian? Or how would you explain it to someone who lives in Belgium? It just doesn't make sense. And so this book is my effort to explain what happened to our system of government, how it got so unrepresentative, and then also to say how we can fix it. And ultimately, I think I came away hopeful that fixing our democracy and making it representative is doable, even if it's going to be pretty difficult.
Yeah, I love the scene in Disney World. I thought that was a perfect sort of bookend to the inauguration. It's funny, I just realized actually we were kind of passing in the air, because I think as you were flying to escape the inauguration, I was actually flying from Florida to Washington for what turned out to be the largest March of Women in recorded history, which is, I think, another sign of like the hope for our democracy. But before we talk about solutions, I want to talk about some of the reasons and people that helped us get into this fix. And of course, your favorite evildoer, and that is Senator Mitch McConnell. And you open the book in an effort to try to crash what you think will be a frat house party. And I didn't know that Mitch McConnell owned the frat house. Anyway, you can tell the whole story, but okay, so how did that go down? What led you to go to Kentucky to try to actually think you're going to somehow fake it into a frat house party and learn all the backstory on Mitch McConnell?
So I should say, by the way, going back to Disney World for a second, I think at like 6 in the morning, the day after the inauguration, we did fly back to DC so that we could be part of the Women's March, my wife and I do agree with what you said word for word. I mean, I think that was the first moment of feeling real hope, not just fear or concern about the fate of our country and the future of our democracy, but feeling like, hey, we still can fix this. Now, to me, Mitch McConnell, I think he was, he's not solely responsible for all the things that have happened in America by any means. But I think of Mitch McConnell as the personification of this idea that the best way to win is by rewriting the rules. And Mitch McConnell, I discovered, I didn't know this before I started writing the book, he was a baseball player in high school and middle school, and he used to be very good. And then he got cut from his 10th grade varsity baseball team. And he was a county all-star pitcher briefly, and then he got cut. And in his memoir, which he called The Long Game, he talks about how he went almost seamlessly from baseball, which was to another sport that was competitive, that involved, team play, and that was politics. And so I think long before Trump was saying, you're going to win so much you'll get tired of winning, here was Mitch McConnell who thought of politics purely about winning. And the transformation of our country really directly is tied back to that. And the other thing is that Mitch McConnell's Senate career, which started in 1984, and my lifetime started in 1986. So when I was writing about the ways that our democracy has changed over my life, those two things just kept coming up over and over again. So naturally, in the same way that if you were writing a book about the Beatles, you might go to Abbey Road and take that famous picture. I felt like I needed to go to Louisville and go on a little Mitch McConnell pilgrimage. So I decided I was going to try to crash a party at his old frat at the University of Louisville. And I will say that if there are any men in their early 30s looking to crash a frat party, I recommend against it. It's kind of weird. It doesn't work very well. You look older to them than they realize. I didn't fully realize that at the time. So it didn't work. But what I discovered, as you alluded to, was that there's this rumor on campus at the University of Louisville that everybody I talked to seemed to agree with, even if they couldn't agree with on the details, that Mitch McConnell actually owns the land underneath the Phi-Tau House, his old fraternity. And the Phi-Tau House is by far, they have the corner lot. It's the nicest spot. And they clearly seem to not have to deal with the same restrictions when it comes to cleanliness and sort of appearance that some of the other frats do. Now, I don't know if Mitch McConnell actually owns this land. I suspect not, to be honest. But what I thought was amazing was, and worrisome, frankly, was that even on campus, there was this sense of there's Mitch McConnell and his team, and they play by one set of rules. And then there's the rest of us, and we play by another set of rules. And I feel like that's starting so early for young people now. And so one of the sense of urgency with the book is, how do we change that before people just accept that that's the way things are?
Absolutely. And I think that's a good way to kind of get into the real focus on this is like, there have been changes to our democracy in your lifetime. Obviously, you're an infant. You are just like starting on this journey. So I would love to know, like, what has changed? And then I think, anyway, yeah, give us kind of like the arc here, and then we can talk about some of the specific examples that are in the book and that we have to figure out how to change.
So let me give you just a couple of the examples from the book that I found most surprising. Number one, the number of Americans who have no voting rights has gone way, way up within my lifetime and really within the last 40 years. And the book is fact-checked, but my brain is not fact-checked. So I'm going to get this almost right, but I can't guarantee it. You have to read the book to get the perfect numbers. But in 1980, when Reagan was first elected, I think it was about 3.8, if I remember correctly, 3.8% of the people living in America who were adults were not eligible to vote. They couldn't even register. By 2016, that number was almost 10%. So it had gone up by more than double. A population that we were talking about, Texas, the population the size of Texas has no voting rights. And I had always thought about that just from a sense of formerly incarcerated people who can't vote because of these discriminatory laws, which is a big problem. but it's also because we failed to do anything about immigration. So you have all these people who, under previous versions of our immigration system, would have been able to earn their citizenship and become Americans with voting rights, are instead stuck in this form of second-class citizenship. And if you look at how those 10% of people would have voted, we would live in a totally different country if we had had a 1980 electorate in terms of voting rights versus a 2021 or 2016 one. The other one I'll just point to briefly, and there's tons of them in the book, unfortunately, I have to say. But the other one that I found really striking was that just since the year 2000, the amount of money spent on federal lobbying, on lobbying Congress, has more than doubled. And so this is not just within my lifetime. I mean, this is within my adult lifetime. You know, this is from what I can remember, the 2000 elections. And what is remarkable about that is, one, that happened, and number two, that Americans don't know that. And I certainly didn't know it before I started writing this book. And so the number of people who are involved in our policymaking process, who work for corporations in particular, instead of for us, the taxpayers, has really gone way up. And again, that's the kind of thing where when I saw that, I just thought, oh my gosh, I mean, I didn't realize it explains a lot about where we are. And I never saw that happening below the surface.
Right. Of course, so few folks do. Can we talk about voting for a second? I know it wasn't really, I know this a little bit of this post your book being finished, and also congratulations on finishing the book and getting published. But we're obviously talking about now, I mean, for the first time in a long, long time, I think people in the United States are beginning to actually be able to see it behind the scenes on why voting is so hard for so many people, certainly with COVID and what we saw in Wisconsin of folks voting in unsafe conditions, but of course still being determined in voting, and really a really kind of remarkable special election. But it seems like in terms of the barriers to voting, that again, I think a lot of people didn't even realize that voting is different depending on what state you live in. There's just so many things. And that we have a government now, a federal government, that's obviously intent on people not voting. Talk a little bit about how much you deal with this in the book, and because I know part of, I mean, obviously the main reason you wrote this is like, what are the solutions here? But we're heading into this potential cataclysmic election in November, where the risk of disenfranchisement of even people who have the right to vote is profound.
Absolutely. And to me, that's where I wanted to start, with voting. So the way I organized the book was first saying who gets to vote, and then thinking about how much each of those votes matter relative to one another, which we can maybe talk about at a later point. But let's focus just on what you described, who gets to vote and who doesn't. And I have to say, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which I think in the book I call it like the Emerald City of liberalism. This, you know, no adult I knew growing up would have said, if somebody doesn't have a job, they're lazy. That was just not, you know, that might be a sort of small c conservative view, but it's not, I never would have heard that. But I absolutely heard people say, well, if you don't, why don't people vote? If you don't vote, you have no right to complain. And when I wrote this book and when I researched this book, what I learned is that in so many cases, it's the opposite, that people can't complain because they have no right to vote, or they have no ability to vote. And we're seeing this all across the country right now. I think particularly, my wife works for a congressman from Atlanta, and the stories coming out of that district and across the state of Georgia last week were just horrifying. And what we're seeing more and more is this combination of elections are not managed professionally in the way they need to be, and often they're being mismanaged on purpose. And we need to be thinking about this question of how do we make sure, not just that we all have voting rights if we live in America and pay taxes in America and so on, but how do we actually make sure that we can exercise our right to vote? One of the things that I found really interesting is that some of this is absolutely voter suppression, and we need to be thinking more about that, and I'm glad the progressive movement is. But there's also things that are you wouldn't think about. So one of the biggest challenges for voting is the poll worker shortage we face in America. This was true long before COVID, but because half of our poll workers are 60 or older, which is the high-risk group for COVID, it's even worse right now. When people ask, what can I do? If I'm talking to a young person, one of the things I say is you can volunteer to work the polls. That can make a big difference. So understanding all of the intricacies of how our elections work, I found actually it was both interesting but also really important for understanding these problems and how we solve them.
Great. No, absolutely. And actually, it's funny, as someone who's a Texan, but I now live in New York, and the challenges until recently of even voting absentee in New York State, which you call it the Emerald City, but I'm telling you, it's not, they don't make it easy. And of course,
Right.
We know that the voting restrictions in all of these states, they fall disproportionately on folks who are working two jobs, who are taking care of kids, all of the various reasons, and why we don't have a national holiday for Election Day is really, I don't know, it makes no sense. I'm supposed to tell folks, if you're listening to David and you want to ask him about other funny things about Barack Obama or anything else, write into the Q&A, and then we'll get your questions to him. Oh my gosh, there's so many things I want to ask you about, and that you write about. Well, one is actually, I think this is it's a point you make in the book that is really important, which is, why do we call it voter suppression? And what would be a better way of describing this? And also, I just want to go back to the point that you made is about sometimes the reasons people can't vote are nefarious plots, and sometimes it's just the incompetence of the system writ large. And of course, that I think is what we're all anxious about as we go into this election, is that even the most enthusiastic, well-funded operation is going to face a lot of problems. But anyway, so some of it's suppression, some of it's not. So what should we call it instead of voter suppression?
Well, the thing that I kept coming back to, and I will say, and by the way, I feel like my publisher tells me I'm supposed to show the book cover all the time, and I have it here.
Oh
so
yeah, put
here's
the book
the cover
up.
of the book. It's very pretty. I did not design it. That's why it's very pretty. The voter suppression, I mean, I thought about some of this as a speechwriter. So I am not a political scientist. I've read more political science than I planned to, 4 years ago, but I'm not a political scientist. I am not a constitutional scholar. I'm sort of dabbling in all of those things, but I am none of them. I do come at this from the speechwriting background, and I have to say, I was stunned by the fact that political reformers, who often have great ideas, seem to be determined to make political reform sound as uninteresting and unimportant as possible, which is a shame because it's so important. And so I think voter suppression is a perfect example of this. I think by now, people understand what it means, which is good. But if you think about the word suppression, no one uses in a sentence, which as a speechwriter, if it's a word that no one uses, you shouldn't use it. So right off the bat, that's a problem. But the other thing that I keep coming back to, I found out about this crazy incident. And on one hand, like so much of American life, right? It's totally shocking and so not shocking. So in 1888 in Conway County, Arkansas, right after an election, a group of masked but white vigilantes broke into a polling place, and they took the ballot boxes out of these African-American polling places in African-American neighborhoods, and they destroyed all the votes. And I think what's important to note is that they didn't say who's voting, they didn't just go through vote by vote. They just said, if we get rid of all the votes that Black people are casting, that'll be good for our preferred party. That'll be good for our white supremacist ideologues. And if you look at what's happening today, it's much more subtle that, nobody is bursting into a polling place, but votes are being destroyed. So if you look at voter purges, right now, 16 million Americans were removed from purge lists between 2014 and 2016. And if you do a little bit of math and look at some recent studies, it seems like somewhere over 2 million of those Americans were eligible to vote. So if you had political operatives going through the country, removing 2 million ballots and just destroying them, there would be an outcry. But instead, because we're doing it subtly and respectably, or not respectfully, respectably, you don't see that. So that's, to me, the voter suppression is really, it's destroying votes. And the other important thing about that is when you suppress something, it comes back. But if you lost your right to vote in this most recent election, or if you were one of the 12,000 Americans disenfranchised by a voter purge in the 2000 election, without which George W. Bush almost certainly would not have become president, you don't get that vote back. you may get to vote later, but you never get that opportunity again. And so I think we're underselling, if anything, just how awful this is.
Yeah, and look, and part of it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, as we know as organizers, because the more people are, pulling their hair out about voter suppression or whatever else, the less we are actually out talking to voters and doing all the things. So I really appreciate that. One thing I think is that you have thought about a lot, and is something that to me is like perplexing, is there's so many problems we have in terms of how unrepresentative our democracy is, whether it is the Electoral College and the fact that we are still like all looking at 3 states and figuring out that they hold the fate of this entire country is mind-boggling. The United States Senate, which as we know has become so disproportionately unrepresentative. The fact that voting, depending on your zip code, you could vote safely, you could vote not safely, you could vote by mail, you can't vote by mail. What are the things, there's so many things that I believe, probably majority of Americans believe we need to change, but what are the things we actually, in your mind, we can do without making a constitutional change? Because so many of these things are really pretty fundamental.
So throughout the book, I had 2 criteria that I was using for every solution that I proposed. Number 1, can we do it without a constitutional amendment? And number 2, can we do it without requiring like Paul Ryan to grow a spine or Mitch McConnell to grow a heart? Right? Those are the 2 boxes that every solution that I thought about needs to check. And it turns out there's still a lot of solutions that fit those criteria. So let me just try to run back through the examples you pointed out. Mm-hmm. So for example, when it comes to the Senate has become very unrepresentative because small states, small population states tend to be rural, and rural states in our current environment tend to be redder than more urban states. So one way we could readjust that balance, not to mention enfranchise about 700,000 taxpayers, is by making DC a state. And we can do that with a law. I mean, in January 2021, Congress could pass a law, President Biden, hopefully, don't want to jinx anything, could sign it, and DC would be a state immediately, if that's what we want. And it wouldn't actually change the balance to favor Democrats. The Senate would still favor Republicans, but it would help readjust that balance and make our country a little bit more fair. So I think we should do it. Similarly, when it comes to voting, we could make voter registration automatic. One of the things I was really surprised to learn is that basically no other countries follow our lead on voter registration. And I think that is important because as Americans, we are proud of being the oldest modern democracy. We're proud of setting the standard that all these other countries want to follow. And yet all of them looked at American democracy and the way we do voter registration and said, no, we'll do it a different way, thank you. And the way they do it in almost every case is to have either people are registered automatically, or in the UK, they have people go from the government, almost like census takers, and register voters. But either way, the public says this is a public good. We could have automatic voter registration with a single law. And then there's some other stuff that's a little bit more complicated, but it's not undoable. So for example, the Electoral College, which you mentioned, and the Electoral College is interesting because it's an example of something that really has changed a lot, and most Americans don't realize how much it's changed. Not that long ago, your odds of living in a swing state were well over 50-50. And today, your odds of living in a swing state are less than 1 in 4. So it's just another way that our country is minimizing the voice of most of us and maximizing the voice of just a few of us. But if the states that are not swing states got together and said, we're going to award all of our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote rather than the state by state popular vote, which is how we do it now, we would get rid of the Electoral College, essentially. We would make it so that the popular vote and the Electoral College never diverge. So all these things are actually really doable. They're really achievable. What they need is a combination of focus, and then also they need us to have the window where we can actually pass laws and get them signed into law.
Yeah, we need the window, we need the political will, we need an enormous amount of public education about why, how much people are disenfranchised. So there's a lot of things that are discouraging, but you have some heroes and heroines. in this book. A couple of my favorite people. One I know is Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who's is a total heroine. So I'd love to know about what made you a big fan of hers. Actually known her a long time. She's awesome. And then also the Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe, I know, comes in also. So, you want to talk about the two of them?
Absolutely. So I did not expect to be the kind of person who sort of has like, is like a super fan of state secretaries of state. That's the danger of writing a book about the political process. And I have to say, so as I was looking through these questions of how do we make it easier to vote, the state secretary of state in almost every state is the person who's in charge of running the election. And I think we often see that in the case of state secretaries of state like Brian Kemp in Georgia, who mismanaged their elections in a strategic way. And in Kemp's case, it was while he was running for governor of Georgia. Jocelyn Benson to me is like the anti-Brian Kemp, not because she's a Democrat, but because she literally wrote the book on how state secretaries of state can help everybody vote. And then she ran for that office and she won. And almost immediately she started dismantling these laws that made it harder for people to vote, including one that was particularly sneaky, that was called Rogers Law, after Mike Rogers, the Republican who pushed it into law. And it basically drove turnout on Michigan State University campus to about zero, almost zero. And she came in and figured out a way to, without a very complicated legal battle, change the ruling or change the way the law was implemented so that now it's essentially used for a voter registration drive on that campus. And again, the point here is not that it's only helping Democrats. The point is that it's helping people vote, and regardless of who they vote for. I just think that's so important. So I'm a huge fan of hers. And then I use Terry McAuliffe as an example in the book, partly because he's just somebody who has like popped in very, very small ways into my political life periodically. I mean, when I was an intern I interned in the John Kerry campaign in the New York office briefly when I was in high school, and he was the DNC chair, and he showed up and he gave a speech, and I forget exactly, I think what I said in the book, at the time I was in high school, I said I would not meet anyone with that much energy until I went to college and made friends with cocaine. Like this was, he has more energy than I think any human I've ever met or heard of. And this I think is probably not a terribly, what's the right word, controversial fact, that everybody knows this about him. What I thought was remarkable about what he did when he was the governor of Virginia is that he took all of this energy, and there was this fight over re-enfranchising formerly incarcerated felons. And he was stymied at every turn. Right? The Republican-controlled legislature didn't want him to be able to do this. The state Supreme Court, which was also very conservative, tried to stop him. And so what he said was, if you won't let me use my powers as governor to re-enfranchise everybody all at once, well, you know what I'll do? I will just grab a pen and a huge stack of hundreds of thousands of forms, and I'm just going to start signing. And one of the things I love about that is he understood how power works. He didn't go back and say, hey, would you please do me a favor and end this system that is giving you political power? Because that's not how politicians operate. And also that he said, let's just do it. Let's just get it done. And it worked. And so all of these people in Virginia, they got their rights restored. They got a letter from their governor telling them that their rights were restored, and they got a registration form in the mail with that package. And so he turned this voter suppression effort, and I end up calling it voter suppression anyway, even though I think we shouldn't. But he ended up turning this voter suppression effort into a voter registration drive. And like that's the energy that I feel like Democrats could really use right now and progressives could use right now as we fight for everyone's right to vote.
No, 100%. And you're right. Not only did Governor McAuliffe, he's irrepressible, but he's a really good governor. And you're right, understood that you have a window in which you can actually build on democratic principles, and he really did. I think you and I could geek out on voter suppression or whatever we're going to call it, and all this, and thinking about this upcoming election. Like I've been looking at, of course, as the rules are changing and how people are using their power to change it. Pennsylvania is another really good example where now people can register to vote by mail. They can actually have no excuses, absentee voting, things that had never existed. And I was looking at the numbers just to kind of put a figure on why this matters. I think in the state of Arizona, where this is very common, something more than 70% of women, who I've really been looking at, vote absentee. And in Pennsylvania, less than 4%. This is, so it's not even a partisan, right? It's just like, are we going to make voting easier for folks, safer, possible? And my home state of Texas, where, as I said, like we're, is one of Richard Murray, I think the famous political pollster, used to say, you know, it's not that Texas is a red state or a blue state, it's a non-voting state. And as we saw in this last cycle in 2018, the electorate expanding dramatically because we actually went out and did the work. But people are asking questions in the chat that don't have anything to do with the stuff that you and I are actually talking about. So I want to ask a question.
That's totally fine. Let's get into it.
Hey, there we go. So one, which I thought was really great, which is that someone who absolutely, it's a former President Obama's leading Amazing Grace in his speech was very powerful. So this is, does he like to sing? And did you do any, also did you work on that speech or another speech? And have you ever written for the future President Joe Biden?
So let's start with the Amazing Grace speech, which I did not write. Cody Keenan, who was the chief speechwriter at the time in the second term, he worked on that speech with the president. And I will say, I didn't watch that. I think I came back to my office and I watched it on the live stream from my office. And what was really interesting to me about that as a speechwriter and as someone who had written for Obama for a number of years at that point, was that you could tell that he kind of paused, and it was a different, it was the song was moving. But as a speechwriter, what I really noticed was the pause before it. Because if you write long enough for a principle, you start to get in touch with what each of those pauses mean. So like, you know, there was a certain pause that President Obama would have when he was like, man, is this better than what the like 25-year-old has written? Yeah, I think so. I'm going to go for it. And like, you know, I could tell that pause. And, you know, he was nearly in every case correct, by the way. But so I knew what those meant. This was different. And I think that moment between when he stopped speaking and when he just decided to sing those words, you know, I think that's a really powerful moment along with the song itself. And the other thing that we talked about it in the context of jokes, but this was obviously a so much more serious context. The fact that President Obama, he did sing sometimes, right? Like he did like a little Al Green during a fundraiser in 2012 that went viral briefly. But, you know, he's a good singer. He's certainly a better singer than I am. He's not a professional singer. And so the fact that he was willing to stand there in front of thousands of people and the entire country and sing alone, not perfectly, well, but imperfectly, there is a vulnerability to that. And there's a lot of things I miss about President Obama, or frankly, you know, any time before the current time. But having a president who is willing to be vulnerable in public is such a special and rare thing. And I think it represents the best of America, because it's this idea that you can be the most powerful person on earth, and also at the same time, you can recognize that you're just a person. And I think there's nothing more excitingly American than that. So I will say, you know, I did not write that speech, but I have a lot of thoughts about it, as you can tell. When it comes to Joe Biden, I don't think, you know, we tended to keep the divide pretty clear between the vice presidential speechwriters and the presidential speechwriters. I will say the teleprompter operators sometimes did both speeches, and they liked doing doing teleprompter for Joe Biden is a challenge. I'll just put it that way. It can be it's like a marathon and a sprint for a teleprompter operator. At least it was during the Obama years. So I have a special thought going out to all the teleprompter operators as they gear up for this campaign.
Are you saying that Vice President Biden sometime added content that wasn't already in the teleprompter?
Just a little bit.
Yeah. I think President Clinton had that talent as well.
Yes.
So someone else, obviously the people who are listening in think you're brilliant, because one of the questions is Donald Trump going to get reelected? And I was like, oh my gosh, if I had only known that I could get on this call with you and find out the answer to that. What do you, I don't know, what's your thinking right now?
Well,
what's your prognosticating?
Cecile, I know the answer 100%, and I buried it at a random page in the book. So you have to buy the book, and then you'll know. That's the way it works. That was my brilliant book selling plan. I actually saw that question in our chat, and I was immediately going to turn it around and ask you what you thought. So I guess I'll just go first because you asked me first, and then I want to hear what you think, because I think you know more. Your estimate or your guess is more educated than mine. I feel like when I've worked on campaigns, my question is never who's going to win, because we don't know. I have generally asked two questions. One is, would I rather be us or them in this moment? And the other is, do we still control what happens? We writ large. And I think right now, both of those answers are the answers you want if you're the Biden campaign. So I think if you look at the recent polling, it is certainly Biden is in a better position than Trump. That doesn't mean that anything is a done deal, but I think that leads into that second question, which is I genuinely think that if everybody who cares so much about what happens in November works as hard as they care, then I feel like the chances of Trump winning drop to a very, very small level. Now, whether that's going to happen or not is ultimately up to us, but at least it's up to us. And I think that's not always true, unfortunately, in campaigns. I mean, I worked on the midterms when Obama was president, and there was really nothing we could do about those ones. But I know you're the Q and I'm the A in theory, but what do you, I want to hear what you think about this one, or how you're thinking about it.
So I think a lot. Obviously, we're at a time of enormous disruption right now and upheaval, and I think we shouldn't get off this call without acknowledging the really important work that's being done to raise the issue of racial justice and injustice that's happening, the murder of Black people in this country, historic racism that we have never dealt with as a country. And so I think I would like to pause for a minute and just say how important, and that is actually on all of us, as we know. In terms of this election, I'm with you on the first question always. Like, would you rather be us than them? 100%. Would rather be a supporter of Joe Biden. I think what I am fascinated by is what's happening with women. I mean, and that's sort of what I'm thinking about and looking at supermajority. And right now, the gender gap between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, women are about 18 points in favor of Joe Biden. And frankly, that's the reason he's leading. And so I guess my plug would be, it's important to pay attention to women of color, the role they are going to play, and why I think it's so exciting and important that there will be a woman on the ticket with Vice President Biden, because I think that is going to be this will be the closest that we're going to come here at this time to having a woman in the executive branch, and that's highly motivating, very exciting. But there's a lot of work to do between now and then. One of the things actually I'm interested in too, and which I'm so glad to get back to the book, why you've written this book is there have been so many folks thrown off the voter rolls. There's so many, we're focused right now, supermajority, of making sure any woman in the country can find out if she's registered, if she's been purged, what are the new rules for voting in her local community, because as we know, they're changing. But I think if we all do that work, we're going to have a record turnout in November, and I'm ready for it, for sure.
That would be one very silver lining to all of this.
Yeah, I suppose that, yeah. So it says here too, this says, I mean, it's a good question. And your book is, again, I'm just saying, get the book, because your book is chock full of this, but someone's writing in, asking, how can we help people vote during the 2020 election season?
So I would have a couple of answers. I mean, one of them is working with organizations, including Supermajority, of course, to just get out and organize, right? And of course, now knocking on doors is less of a thing than it was before the pandemic, but there's all kinds of digital organizing that is happening. And so there's so many different ways to become part of that. Some that I think I wouldn't have guessed before I started working on this. Number one, I mentioned this earlier, but if you're in a low risk group for COVID, or you've recovered from COVID, volunteering to work the polls, I think is really going to be important for bringing down those hours and hours long lines that we saw. And I mean, I voted in DC. I voted 2 weeks ago. I voted by mail, but there was a voting center across the street from the mailbox where I dropped off my ballot, and the line was just around the block. So more poll workers would make an enormous difference. The second thing that I think is, Cecile, something that you just alluded to, which is it's not enough to register to vote or to register your friends to vote. You have to double check. And in this election in particular, this is an election where it is worth double checking. So, vote.org has great resources for this. And there's other good online ones as well, to see whether your registration is still current. And don't wait until the day after the registration deadline to double check. Double check well in advance so that you can re-register if you need to. And I should be clear, no one should need to do that. But in this election, some people will. So make sure that you and the people who you know and care about are not on that list of people who aren't able to vote. And similarly, you can figure out vote.org is a really good place to learn your state rules for elections. And this is just the kind of thing where, like, the way I describe it sometimes, it's a little bit like if you pop the hood on your democracy, right? Like I am not a car person. I grew up in New York City, but you need to be able to do a little DIY understanding of how your republic works and how your elections work. So the more you know about your local election laws and the more you spread that knowledge. One last thing that I will say, I think Facebook is problematic, to say the least, but it is still an important way people are getting information. One of the most important pieces of information people need to hear is that all of these states are now rightly they're going to count votes that were postmarked by election day rather than votes that were received by election day. Not every state, so you have to check, but many states are doing the right thing and getting more votes to count. But we know that Trump and a lot of other Republicans, we saw this in 2018, are going to say that we shouldn't count those ballots, or that if a ballot comes in after election day, it's fraudulent. Even if it's totally legal, even if this was all on the books beforehand, they're going to use this to cast doubt on the elections. So way before that, we need to get out there and start to say, this is how this is going to work. We may not know the winner of Arizona. That's the state I'm probably most concerned about right now. We may not know who wins Arizona on election night. We may find out 4 days later. We may find out 5 days later. That doesn't mean that something happened that was untoward. It means that the process was working the way it was supposed to. So spreading that information is really important as well.
Absolutely. And I would just like emphasize, also as an organizer or someone who is doing this work, people tend to think that somehow they have to do something magically far beyond their local squad. Or if everybody just focused on even the people that are in their community and the people they knew, and make sure they were registered, and as you say, knew their registration status, checked it, figured out how they could vote early, vote safely, everyone can play a role, even if they can't do a whole lot more than that. There's a couple of last things that have come in here, and I think I've got time to ask you one last question. This was actually, someone said no one has read the book yet because it comes out tomorrow, so that's important. We have to keep saying to everybody, right? Buy the book.
I've read the book, in fairness, but
yeah, same.
Yeah,
same. So some of it has, but I know other people. So it comes out tomorrow. I think this is a nice point that someone made. You said that I mentioned young people can get involved in polling places. How about those of us over 60 who may be retired and have time to help somehow? And it's really such an important point, because I think actually this is what we're seeing as a sort of intergenerational, there are so many people who want to do something more and love the youngsters and the youth. But I think it's a really, really good point. Maybe you could just, I'll lob that over the plate for you, and then I'll let you finish up, and I'll hand it back to WGBH.
Okay. And before you go, Cecile, I just want to thank you one more time for joining me and talking about all of these issues. I know that you're, rather busy saving our democracy full time. So the fact that you could take some time and talk through the book, but more importantly, all the ideas about what we can do, to make sure that we keep this country that we love. I really appreciate it. And so thank you for that.
Sure.
I should also say, I think that's a great question about how people who are over 60 and might have otherwise worked the polls, what should they do? And I think one of the things that, I don't know, I guess one of the things that people my age, younger, I hope are recognizing right now is that we talk about a lot of inequities in American life, and they're all important to think about. I think during COVID, we have seen the way that America treats older people is not right. And I think that's something else we need to think about. So I think the fact that I frankly did that a little bit and focused on what young people can do, that's a mistake. And along those lines, I think that if you're, if you don't want to work the polls because you're at higher risk, for example, I just got off, I was recording a podcast for Swing Left, which is a great organization. And they were talking about all of these letter writing parties. So rather than knocking on doors, writing letters to voters to remind them to vote, to remind them to register, to remind them to double check their registration. That's absolutely something you can do, and that's Swing Left. Some other things you can do, and this is also, again, really simple, but as Cecile was saying, it makes such a big difference. On Facebook, you don't need to get into fights with everybody, but just to let people know what accurate information is, let people know in your own network, know about when the deadline is to register. Let them know about what's going on, right? Disinformation is such a big issue. So I think that's another thing that we're seeing, and to be able to be a part of, politely but firmly standing up for facts is going to matter a lot in this election. So I would say those two things are kind of small examples of what you can do regardless of your age, to help, protect a republic that we all want to preserve.
So this is David Leonard. I'm back with you both. Cecile, thank you so much for this part of the conversation so far. I know you have to leave us, and we're very appreciative of you participating tonight. David, if you're up, we can keep the conversation going a little bit longer.
Yeah, my
Take
pleasure.
a few more questions, and I've got a few of our own to transition with.
That sounds great.
You made a distinction early on between you as a speechwriter and not a political scientist. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started in speechwriting and then how you got to be one of President Obama's speechwriters.
Absolutely. So I started when I was in college. I graduated in 2008. I was in an improv group. I edited a humor magazine. I thought that I was going to go into comedy. So I imagined that I would move to New York or I'd move to LA and pursue that. Yeah. And then I saw President Obama give a speech. And this was after, it was after the Iowa caucuses, and he had just won the Iowa caucuses. And he delivered this speech. And I remember one of the most important lines in that speech is he said, "Faced with impossible odds, people who love this country can change it." And I remember thinking, oh, he's talking about me. And then I realized that, millions of people simultaneously were thinking, oh, he's talking about me, which is why it was such a good speech. But for me, I never had to wonder whether or not a speech could change the trajectory of someone's life because it changed mine. And I started working on the campaign as a field organizer, knocking on doors, talking to voters, talking to volunteers. And then I moved to DC, and I kind of fell, bass backwards into this job as a speechwriter at a firm called West Wing Writers, which was all run by former Clinton speechwriters. And I kind of learned the trade there. I got very lucky. They were terrific. And then 2 years later, I was about to leave Washington, and I got coffee with John Favreau, who someone introduced me to. He was the president's chief speechwriter at the time. He's now the host of Pod Save America. And he said, well, Valerie Jarrett, who is one of President Obama's senior advisors, she is looking for a speechwriter. She hasn't been able to find somebody. So if you applied, you would actually be the only applicant for this White House job. And I said, I like those odds. I think I could do that. So I ended up working for Valerie for more than a year, and then moving to the campaign and working for the president, and then coming back to the White House and working for the president. But, like any dream job like that, a lot of luck was involved.
I'm also interested in your thoughts now on how special that moment was, and if you were looking back at other great presidential speeches of the last 10, 20, 100 years, and how you put that narrative together in a way that says this was either special or not necessarily.
And which moment were?
Yeah, where President Barack Obama becomes the first Black president for the United States, and he brought a charismatic sense of himself and vision to the role that do all presidents have that, or was there something in particular that was his?
David, I don't want to get you into any trouble, but no, not all presidents have that. You don't need to go far to find an example of a president who may not. I would say that, to me, one thing that all presidents have in common is that in some way or another, they meet the moment. It's not just that they are politically talented. It's not just that they're, that they build good campaigns or they give good speeches or whatever they do well. It's that they're the right fit for that moment in time. It's very hard, I think, to get elected president without that marriage of person and moment. And so I think that one of the things I found when I've talked with people who have worked for other presidents is everybody has different stories, everybody has different experiences, but almost everybody has that same set of emotions about the administration they work for. And I find myself sometimes thinking, well, they can't all be right, but to some extent they can all be right, in that every presidency begins in this sense of we were ushered in to do something exciting and hard and important, and we get to be a small part of it. And I think that that's been true for current situation accepted. I think that's been true for every presidency, certainly of my lifetime and before that. And I think it's one of the things that gives me a lot of hope about American politics. Kind of like the moment when you can hear the West Wing theme song playing a little bit. I think that is doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen, and I think it's very special.
Yeah, I think as we reflect on some of current reality, and we have news coming out of Atlanta of another Black man killed, and if we look at this moment and compare it to certainly the early years of the Obama presidency, there's this contrast that becomes very, very stark, where we might have thought that having the first Black president was an even more significant moment than it turned out to be. And now we're still dealing with the legacy of racism in America, which didn't go away with his presidency, but simply has come back again. So is there a sense where writing for the first Black president brought in, a new dimension to the role as speechwriter, or was you were just writing for the president and that was it?
Well, I think that to his credit, I think President Obama was very, very clear that his election was historic, and it represented, I think, the best of what America can do. I mean, I remember when I was 21 years old, and the primaries were just beginning, and this Barack Obama guy was running for president. I remember telling friends very confidently, because I was in college and I was, just a good time to tell people things confidently when you don't know what you're talking about. And I said, well, I can't imagine that we'll ever see a Black president in my lifetime. And, I was 21. And I did genuinely think that. I think it's remarkable. It's a remarkable statement about what America can do at its best. That doesn't change the fact that America also has this other story that we have never fully grappled with. And I think that was true during the Obama administration as well. It's not like, the legacy of racism went away for 8 years and then has returned. It's that it was always there, and we're always going to be plagued by that until we do more. And I think if this is not a thing that we're two white men discussing this issue. This is not something that I claim to be fully in understanding of. But I do think that hopefully as a country, we realize that we need to do a much more thorough reckoning than the one that maybe many of us thought we needed to. That this isn't just sort of a sideshow in American life. This is something, let me bring it back to something I know more about now, which is the issues in this book and the political process. the ways that racism and white supremacy were embedded within the political process. Cecile had talked about growing up in Texas. In Texas, they didn't have statewide voter registration until the 1960s. They had the poll tax, which they used to keep non-white voters from the polls. And they also passed this law. They said, if we ever have to get rid of our poll tax, we will replace it with another plan to keep people from voting, and we'll call it statewide voter registration. So in Texas, the statewide voter registration that people are using, and as Cecile pointed out, it's a non-voting state. Turnout is very low. One of the reasons is because it was specifically designed as a plan B for Jim Crow. And that's certainly not something I was taught in school. It's not something I learned in Schoolhouse Rock, right? But until we start to examine all of that and remove that stain from our institutions, they're going to continue to be corrupted by this. And it's if you look at what's happening today, we are being reminded, and it's unfortunate that we needed to be reminded, but we're being reminded that racism and authoritarianism are not separate forces. They always go hand in hand. That if we want a democracy, we have to do something about taking that stain of racism out of our institutions. And if we don't, we're not going to be left with a democracy.
And I think you've turned the conversation back to the question of participation in democracy, which may be more challenging or differently challenging for different parts of the population. But what else? Is participation, it's not just a left issue. Participation is something that is suppressed, if we'll use that. We'll continue to use the word that you don't like using, but it's suppressed on all parts of the spectrum.
Yeah, so to me, voter participation should not be a political issue, and among voters, it's not a political issue. So in a poll, I think it was taken 4 years ago, 70% of Americans said that high turnout is good for democracy. Now, you can't get to 70% with just one party. In fact, you can't just get there with one party and independents. You need everybody to at least more or less agree with this idea. So it's only among politicians that voter participation is a political issue. Among voters, we agree on this stuff. And I will also add, if you look at the Americans who are unregistered and could register, who are eligible and unregistered, a lot of those people also fit President Trump's base. The reason that the Republican Party has thus far been not super excited about trying to register those voters is that what you see in countries with universal turnout, because voting is compulsory, like Australia, Belgium,
Nordic countries, right? Yeah.
What you see in those countries is not that the left party wins more or the right party wins more. What you actually see is the tax structure favors the rich less. So it's not so much that Republicans would win or Democrats would win, but you'd have a lot more actual populists in the party. And so the next time a 2017 style tax bill comes through the ranks and people say, hey, are we going to give, $1 trillion plus tax cuts to the top income earners? You would have fewer people in your base who agree with that idea. So I think there is a reason, unfortunately, that participation has become political among our politicians, but it is certainly not political among the rest of us.
It's almost like you want people to be compelled to participate more because it's good for society, as opposed to simply protecting your own issues or your own values or defending them against what you think is the opposite. But that may be what motivates people. So do you have a sense of which is more important?
Well, here's what I would generally say. I think in American life, in American politics, we often hear this idea that it's kind of populism versus elitism, right? The populists versus the elitists. What surprised me is the more I learned about it, is the more you realize on all of these issues, the people and the experts, the populists and the elitists are on the same page. Mm-hmm. So I've gone through a bunch of them, but like on taxes, for example, is just a really good example. When I was a kid, upper income tax cuts were actually fairly politically popular. For most of my life, they have not been. And that change has been important. And the economic experts agree that the benefits of cutting taxes for those at the very top is not very valuable. Mm-hmm. So again, you have the populists and the elitists, and they're all in alignment. So I don't know that, my view is not that in a democracy we get everything we want. And certainly no individual gets everything, you or I will not get everything we want, because sometimes we're going to feel one way and most people will agree with us. More importantly, in a democracy, progress might come more slowly than it would if somebody could wave a wand or say, this is how it's going to be. But I think ultimately that idea that we can govern ourselves is worth it. It's worth sometimes progress coming a little bit more slowly. But it has to be real. We have to make that idea real. And it's also worth, sometimes not getting what we want, but we have to make that idea real.
Now, your conversation with Cecile did talk a bit about the book, which I did get to see some of beforehand. So there's one more person that's at least read some of the book before tomorrow. And we focused a lot on participation and voter registration as a big piece of the diagnosis. You also look at the relationship between the branches of government and the role lobbyists have played. Do you want to just comment on that before we take a few more questions to wrap us up from the group?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did go back to Schoolhouse Rock. I'm Just a Bill, the little cartoon journey that inspired me. That was my introduction to political science when I was about 6. And I think what is interesting about that is it laid out this idea of a political process where that was relatively straightforward, right? The House considers a bill, the Senate considers it, committees, the president, and you're done. Our political process, even within those branches of government, has changed. So the Senate, because of the way that the filibuster's always existed, or at least it's existed since the 1830s. It actually hasn't always existed. But the way it's existed throughout our lifetimes has changed. It now takes 60 votes to pass the most basic legislation. That was not true a decade ago, or I guess it wasn't true 11 years ago. Meanwhile, if you look at the House, there was something that was created in the 90s called the Hastert rule. That's not an official rule, but it's used frequently, which says a bill won't get brought to the floor unless it has a majority of the votes of a majority of the party in control. So that basically means 1/4 of the representatives can veto a bill. In political science, these are all known as veto points, right? These are just checks that a bill has to pass, and if the bill doesn't make it across that bridge, it dies. And there's more of them than they used to be. And so what is happening is that in nearly every case, it is making it harder for legislation that has popular support and that would be good for the country to pass. There's the old idea of Congress as like a cooling, Jefferson and Washington apocryphally once described it as, you pour the tea into a saucer to cool it. And so you boil up your tea in the House and you pour it into the Senate, and you have this kind of marriage of passion and responsibility. Bills that pass that test, that have popular support and expert approval, are not getting through. And bills that everybody agrees are bad ideas are getting through. So, and that's not an accident. That's because the legislative process is not functioning the way it used to.
Okay. I'll start taking a few last questions from the chat. One question is, what did you learn researching this book that informs what you think about the moment we're currently living in?
What I learned researching this book that I think is most important for understanding, like if you turn on the news, you'll see it differently, at least I do, is that if you look at the communities in America that are most affected by police violence and certainly by systemic racism in all sorts of different ways, those are also the communities that have seen their voting rights attacked over the last 40 years in a completely unprecedented way, and far more aggressively than any other community. And so just to give you one example, and there are unfortunately so many examples, but the number of polling places in America, just the number of places you can go vote, dropped by more than 10% between 2008 and 2016. But those cuts did not fall equally on everybody. Those polling place cuts were more likely, substantially more likely, to be in neighborhoods that are minority, in non-white majority neighborhoods. And so one of the things that is happening in American life right now, and one of the things that, I think that those of us who have some power, those of us who have some privilege, need to be thinking about is, it's not enough to just say, vote in November. Mm-hmm. We need to remember that there are people who are protesting for their rights right now, who because of these new laws, even though they were eligible to vote in the past, either can't vote or they theoretically can vote but aren't able to exercise those rights. So it's not just enough to say, let's bring change from the streets to the ballot box. We also need to make it so that elections are actually an avenue for change in a way that they still are. You absolutely should go vote, but it's harder than it should be, and we should change that. We need to change that.
I'm going to paraphrase the next question because I want to tie it back to your 6-year-old story of how a bill becomes a law, which is, how do we use public schools today, given all of the new pressures, to really encourage greater participation, greater understanding about maybe how things really are working rather than how they were supposed to work?
So I'm not an expert in this at all. So I'm not going to claim to have a clear answer here. I guess what I will say is, if you look at the way that that we learn these issues in school, it's certainly helpful, right? Like, I took AP Government, I guess. But the things that really get people to understand these issues tend to be that connection between what happens on a sort of very granular level with our government and what happens in their lives. So I'll give you 2 examples, and they're both local rather than national. So one, and I've talked a little bit about this, but in Cincinnati, if you're a high school student, you can get the day off to work the polls. So I talked about how there's a poll worker shortage in America. In Cincinnati, that poll worker shortage is being relieved by this cohort of young people. They're tech savvy, they have a lot of energy. They are getting a civics lesson in the process. And I think that's so, the learning by doing really matters. Similarly, I think when people start to get involved in their local campaigns, that matters a lot more, especially for younger people early on. So I think one of the best things, one of the organizations that I've been really proud to be supportive of and to just, talk about every chance I get, it's called Run for Something. And they help young people run for local office. And I think when young people see someone like them running for office, and not just the president, right, but somebody running for city council or mayor or school board, it gets people this sense of what happens, the decisions we make ultimately come back and help shape our future. And once you believe that basic idea, then it's very easy to go forward and learn more. And you're not counting on just teaching people. People want to learn. And I think that's always very important.
And these are tips for getting involved locally, regardless what part of the political spectrum that you're on.
Absolutely.
Or if you don't have a political affiliation at all, it's about getting involved and owning our society.
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't shy away from the fact that I personally am a Democrat, but I think running for office is something that you should do if you care about things, and that's regardless of how the change you want to see. And I think that also gets back to the heart of how I feel about the book, which is I want to live in a democracy where, I and the party I belong to have ideas we believe in, but we're not going to win elections unless we convince people to agree with us. We're not going to win elections because I think that process would yield better ideas for everybody. And I think that the danger becomes, if you have a one-party democracy in any context, the ideas get less good, the policies get less good.
So that's an interesting point about discourse. Because discourse needs to happen between people who don't already agree with each other, or it's not perhaps really, it's discussion certainly, but not necessarily discourse. And to have these kind of frameworks or opportunities for discussion requires people from all parts of the spectrum to be involved in their society, in their local government, in their democracy to get going. Are there particular books that you would, and I know what the first answer to this question is going to be, but are there books, plural, that you would recommend as an introduction to politics today?
Yes, I'll recommend some books that are not my own. I think that's only appropriate, and some that I really enjoyed. I would read a book called Winner Take All Politics by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. A pair of Yale law professors. They're great. I don't have my keyboard in front of me, or I'd add these to the chat. Maybe I can just add right before I log off. I'll get them on there. Winner Take All Politics. Give Us the Ballot. I think that's back there. I think these are actually all back there somewhere. Give Us the Ballot, which is a book by Ari Berman, who's kind of the leading voting rights reporter in America right now. And it's his history of the Voting Rights Act, and also how the Voting Rights Act has been undermined. It's not uplifting necessarily, but it's important. It's a good book. Some others here. I'm actually going to check just trying to remember, because I have there's a whole suggested reading thing here, and I feel like now I know why I put it in there, so that I could check through this. Another really good one, Lee Drutman's book, The Business of America is Lobbying. If you want to understand how lobbying really works, Lee is a political scientist, but he's a accessible political scientist, which is very rare. And I'm trying to find a good, I'm going to end with one more. I would recommend a book called Why Cities Lose, and that came out last year. That's a little wonky, but again, it's readable, and it's about the urban-rural divide in American politics. And it's a really fascinating look at this question that comes up again and again and again, which is that if you live in a city, like say DC, where I am, or Boston, where you are, does not matter. Knowing nothing else about you, I can tell you that your vote is less meaningful. It matters less than someone who lives in a rural area. And why is that? And what does that mean for democracy, not just in the US, but around the world? I will say, and again, not just because I'm, plugging my own book or whatever, I have a whole list, and I recommend, I tried to put in the suggested reading books that I would really enjoy reading, not just books that I think are valuable, because generally speaking, if I don't find a book enjoyable, I can't get through it. So that made it easy to pass that test.
And yours is certainly very accessible as well, so people shouldn't be scared away from that.
I would hope not.
We're getting several of the books added to the chat right now, and one of the beauties of also posting the recording of this conversation later is that we can add those resources to the webpage at that point in time too. So I know what's next. What's next is promoting your book and getting more people engaged in the issues, but do you know what comes next after the next?
Well, to me, what comes right next after the next is they're related, which is the thing that I care a lot about is thinking about this upcoming election, how we can make sure that it is safe and fair. I also, as somebody who belongs to a political party, I also care about who wins. And not just on the presidential level, I care about it throughout the ticket. But I think, it's so easy in every single election. I've written this line before to say, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. I think that is true. Again, I think it was true last time around, and I think it's true this time around also. So I'm trying to think about what can I do to, the beauty of writing a book is that you get to think about something for years and years on end, and you just get to kind of be alone with your thoughts. And that's also the thing where I'm so excited to be doing something else for a while. And thinking about how to put some of these ideas into practice.
And I'm guessing because you chose this book, you were interested in bringing about change. So I want to ask you, what gives you hope for the future, despite all the challenges that are in front of us, either politically or with both of the public health emergencies we're facing as a country and as a society?
Well, I'll tell you a story about what gives me hope, and it's a little bit long, but I think it's worth it. My first book, I talked a lot about a woman named Cecile Richards, who I wrote a speech for at the 2012 Democratic Convention, and her daughter, Zoe, who was about 2 years old at the time, and Zoe was born with a congenital heart defect. And so she needed several open heart surgeries by the time she was 3 years old. And without the Affordable Care Act, her parents, there's a really good chance they would not have been able to afford these surgeries, or they would have gone bankrupt affording them. It's possible that Zoe would not have lived. And so I wrote this speech for Stacey, and it was one of the most inspiring speeches I got to write, because it was about that connection between the things you work so hard for, the policies you work so hard for, and the lives of people who need government to be on their side. At the end of my first book, I went back to Arizona, where Zoe lives, and got to hang out with her at a karate class and just watch this kid who was, may not have lived if you had had a president make a different set of decisions. And she's like kicking and punching, and it was very inspiring. But then a couple of days ago, Stacey posted something on social media, and she said, Zoe decided to do this on her own. And Zoe was taking a knee. She was at home and she was kneeling for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in honor of George Floyd. And I think she's 10 now.
Uh-huh.
Something she's around that age. But this moment where you realize, to me, like, that's something that makes me so inspired about America. Not just this idea that we can help each other, but that then once we've been helped, we become the kind of person who wants to go out and do something else for someone who needs someone on their side right now. And so to watch a kid figure that out, I mean, you think, well, if this kid can figure all that out after the life she's already led, I think we might be okay. So I feel pretty hopeful.
And it does seem that on, whether it's gun violence, gun control, climate change, the current wave of protests that are in general very peaceful, perhaps passionate and angry, and legitimately so, but still peaceful. It is young people that are at the center of all of these movements and responses to current moments. So that perhaps is also borne out in your story about that individual girl who you're telling us about. Yeah,
I think at 33, I feel like I'm not an old person by any means, but I am also I'm not the youngest person in the room in most cases. And often the youngest people in the room are the ones who I feel like really get it viscerally in a way that I frankly wish that I had when I was 22. I'm really impressed by the energy and the empathy that so many young people today have. I feel like they're appropriately bewildered by the state of the world. They say, this doesn't make sense. We should do better. And they're going to, which is very exciting.
Maybe we'll end on this note, but perhaps that youthful enthusiasm can apply regardless of what age one actually is.
That's certainly true. Actually, and I'll end with another sort of thing I learned with when I worked for President Obama, because I was always struck by this, because it's not my inclination, right? Like I am, I'm the kind of person where a new technology comes around and I'm skeptical. How does that work? That seems too complicated. And that's always been true, regardless of, age. President Obama, anytime there was something new, his first thought was, why is this exciting? Why is this inspiring? How can this be part of the change we're all trying to work toward? And I don't do that naturally, but I do try to think about how he used to approach those things, and I try to emulate that when I can, because I think, right, when I talk about young people who inspire me, it's not an age thing. It's about this kind of sense of the world is one way and it should be another way, and I can be part of getting us from here to there. And it is so incredibly fortunate that we can plausibly say that. I mean, that's just like, we take it for granted, but in most of human history, in most of the world today, people don't have that opportunity, that if you said that, there would be no truth to it. And so the fact that we still live in a country where we want it to be different and we can make it different, no matter how hard it is, I mean, that's just an extraordinarily fortunate thing, I think.
Well, David, thank you so much for sharing your book with us. Thank you for the conversation this evening. Good luck with the official launch tomorrow. And our thanks, although she's already left us, our thanks go to Cecile for a great conversation earlier in our program this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really, I really appreciate it.